How are you feeling today?
A little tired but present.
That feels like the right place to start.
There's a strange kind of confusion that comes when nothing is obviously wrong, yet something still feels off. Your life looks fine from the outside. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You wake up, you function, you move forward. And if someone asked you how you're doing, you'd probably say, I'm okay. But inside, there's this quiet feeling you can't name. Not sadness exactly, not unhappiness in a clear way, just a sense of being lost.
I think that's what makes this feeling so difficult to talk about. Because when life looks fine, you don't feel like you have the right to feel confused or empty. You tell yourself, other people have it worse. You should be grateful. You're lucky. And so you stay silent. You minimize what you're feeling, even to yourself.
Yes, and that silence becomes heavy over time. Because when you can't clearly point to what's wrong, you start questioning yourself instead. You wonder if you're ungrateful, if you're dramatic, if you're asking for too much from life. And that self-doubt slowly replaces the original feeling, making everything even more confusing.
What's interesting is that this sense of being lost often appears during periods that are supposed to feel stable, when things finally calm down, when you reach a goal you work toward, when the chaos fades and there's space to breathe. Instead of relief, you're left with a question you didn't expect. Is this it?
That question can be unsettling, because it challenges the idea that achievement automatically brings clarity. You did what you were told would make you happy. You followed the path. You made responsible choices. And yet, you don't feel grounded. You don't feel connected to where you are.
I think feeling lost doesn't always mean you're failing. Sometimes it means you've outgrown a version of your life that once fit you. But because that life still looks good, it's hard to admit that it no longer feels right.
Exactly. There's a difference between a life that looks fine and a life that feels meaningful. And many people spend years living inside that gap without realizing it. They keep moving, keep performing, keep checking the boxes, while quietly feeling disconnected from themselves.
And when you don't understand that feeling, you try to fix it in surface ways. You stay busy. You distract yourself. You scroll. You plan the next thing. Because stopping feels dangerous. Stopping means listening.
Listening can bring up uncomfortable truths, like realizing you don't know what you want anymore, or that the dreams you were chasing were never really yours, or that you've been living on autopilot for longer than you want to admit.
That realization doesn't come with drama. It comes quietly, in moments where everything is calm, but you feel distant from your own life.
And the hardest part is explaining this feeling to others. Because how do you say, I feel lost, when nothing is visibly falling apart? When there's no clear reason? So you stay quiet. You smile. You keep going.
But feeling lost isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. Often, it's a sign that something inside you is asking for attention. Not answers yet, just honesty.
Maybe this feeling isn't meant to be rushed or fixed. Maybe it's meant to be understood, to be sat with. Because sometimes feeling lost is the beginning of finally asking yourself the right questions.
I think one of the biggest reasons this feeling of being lost exists is because we grow up surrounded by expectations that we never consciously choose. From a very young age, life is introduced to us as a kind of timeline, almost like a silent agreement we're expected to follow without question. You learn early on that there is a right order to things. You study, you work, you build, you settle, and each step is framed as progress, as proof that you're moving forward in the correct direction.
What's interesting is that no one ever really asks you whether this sequence fits you. It's simply presented as the way life works. And when everyone around you is following the same pattern, it becomes difficult to tell the difference between guidance and pressure. You internalize these expectations so deeply that they start to feel like your own desires, even when they're not.
So you move through life checking boxes instead of asking questions. You aim for milestones instead of meaning. And you assume that fulfillment is something that arrives automatically at the end of the process, like a reward for obedience, patience, and effort. If you do everything right, happiness is supposed to follow.
But the problem is that life doesn't always work that way. You can follow the sequence perfectly and still feel disconnected. You can reach the milestones and still feel unsure of who you are. And when that happens, it's deeply unsettling because the system you trusted no longer makes sense.
That's when confusion turns inward. Instead of questioning the expectations themselves, you question yourself. You wonder why you don't feel satisfied, why you don't feel grounded, why the life you work toward doesn't feel like home. And because everything looks right from the outside, you assume the problem must be you.
This is where the feeling of being lost truly begins. Not because you don't have direction, but because the direction you followed was never fully yours. You were moving forward, but not inward. And eventually, that gap becomes impossible to ignore.
I think the moment we begin to feel truly lost is often the moment we start questioning who we are beyond our roles. Not the titles we carry, not the responsibilities we perform, not the labels that make our lives look organized and understandable from the outside, but the person underneath all of that. The part of us that exists before productivity, before expectations, before proving anything to anyone. For many people, that question feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Because for most of our lives, we are taught to introduce ourselves through what we do, our work, our achievements, our usefulness. We learn early on that identity is something you earn, not something you explore. So we become very good at performing roles, and very disconnected from the quieter parts of ourselves that don't have clear definitions. And when you've spent years identifying with roles, stepping outside of them can feel destabilizing. It can feel like standing in empty space without a script, without instructions. Because roles come with structure, and structure creates a sense of safety. Even if that structure feels limiting, it's familiar. So when life slows down, or when a role no longer fulfills you the way it once did, the question of who you are without it can feel threatening. Not because you don't exist beyond your roles, but because you haven't been encouraged to meet that version of yourself. The version that isn't measured by output, success, or approval. The version that simply wants to feel aligned, alive, and honest. That's why feeling lost isn't always about lacking direction. Sometimes it's about realizing that the identity you've been living from was never complete. And recognizing that truth requires courage because it asks you to slow down, listen inwardly, and allow yourself to change without knowing exactly who you'll become next.
When life finally offers a moment of stillness, those quieter parts of you begin to surface. Not loudly, not with clear instructions, but as a subtle emotional shift, a sense that something feels slightly off, even if you can't explain why. It often happens in ordinary moments. During a pause between tasks, late at night when there's nothing left to distract you, or in the silence that follows accomplishment, when you realize that reaching the next milestone didn't bring the relief you expected. In those moments, you may notice a feeling that's hard to name. Not sadness exactly. Not dissatisfaction in a dramatic sense. Just a quiet awareness that you're present in your life but not fully connected to it. That you're moving through your days competently, responsibly, yet emotionally at a distance. This is often when people say they feel lost. Not because they lack structure or direction, but because they lack resonance. Their life makes sense on paper, but it doesn't fully register internally. And that disconnect can feel confusing, especially when nothing appears wrong. The difficult part is that stillness doesn't create this feeling, it reveals it. It brings attention to what busyness has been covering up. And once that awareness appears, it's hard to ignore. You can distract yourself again, but the feeling lingers beneath the surface, waiting for another quiet moment to return. This is not a failure of discipline or motivation. It's a signal of inner misalignment, a reminder that functioning well is not the same as feeling fulfilled, and that something inside you is asking to be acknowledged, even if you don't yet know how to respond.
At this point, fear often enters quietly, almost unnoticed. Not the kind of fear that feels dramatic or obvious, but a subtle resistance to going any deeper. Because listening to yourself means opening a door you've kept closed for a long time. There is a fear that if you listen too closely, you'll hear something inconvenient, something that doesn't fit neatly into the life you've built. You might realize that certain choices were made out of obligation rather than desire, that some paths felt safe, but never truly felt right. And acknowledging that can feel destabilizing, especially when your sense of security depends on the structure you already have. So instead of listening, many people learn to stay busy. They fill their time with responsibilities, goals, and constant motion. Not because they lack ambition, but because movement creates distance from uncomfortable truths. As long as you're moving forward, you don't have to ask whether you're moving in the right direction. And avoidance doesn't always look like chaos. Often, it looks like a very organized life, a reliable routine, a schedule full of commitments. On the surface, everything appears stable, but underneath, there's a quiet tension, the sense that something important is being postponed. This is where many people begin to doubt themselves. They tell themselves they're overthinking, that they should be grateful, that everyone feels this way sometimes. And while those thoughts can be comforting in the moment, they also minimize something real that's happening internally. Because this feeling isn't a flaw, it's a signal. A sign that you're becoming more aware of yourself, not less. That you're starting to notice the difference between living efficiently and living honestly. And awareness, once it appears, doesn't disappear easily. You can push it aside for a while, but it has a way of returning. Often stronger. Often clearer. Asking again, in quieter but more persistent ways, to be acknowledged. This is the threshold many people stand at when they say they feel lost. Not lost in the sense of having nowhere to go, but lost in the sense of no longer being able to ignore themselves. And while that moment feels unsettling, it's also the beginning of something more intentional.
And maybe this is the part that's hardest to accept, that feeling lost doesn't come with immediate answers. There's no sudden clarity that arrives and makes everything make sense. No clear sign that tells you exactly what to do next. Just a growing awareness that something inside you is asking to be heard. We often expect understanding to come before change. We tell ourselves we'll act once we feel certain, once things feel clear, once the fear disappears. But for many people, clarity doesn't come first. It comes slowly through attention, through small moments of honesty, through allowing yourself to sit with questions instead of rushing to resolve them.
And that can feel uncomfortable in a world that values certainty, where not knowing is often seen as weakness. But there is a quiet strength in staying present with uncertainty, in admitting that you don't have everything figured out, and that you don't need to.
Because being lost doesn't mean you're disconnected from yourself. Sometimes it means you're closer than you've ever been. Close enough to notice what no longer fits. Close enough to feel the tension between who you've been and who you're becoming.
And maybe that's enough for now. Not answers, not decisions, just awareness, just honesty, just the willingness to listen, even when the path ahead isn't clear.
If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, maybe that's not something to fix right away. Maybe it's something to acknowledge. a sign that you're paying attention to yourself in a deeper way.
Feeling lost doesn't mean you're behind. It doesn't mean you failed. It often means you've outgrown something even if you don't yet know what comes next.
And it's okay to move forward without a map, to take small steps without full certainty, to trust that understanding will meet you along the way.
For now, maybe it's enough to stay open, to stay curious, to allow yourself to be exactly where you are.